Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Saturday, January 17th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The weather in Riverside today brings a high of 80.3 degrees and a low of 56.0, making for a mild winter day perfect for getting out and about. Coming up on today's show, we'll examine why the U.S. Congress is hurrying to reassure Denmark in the wake of President Trump's threats regarding Greenland, and break down California's decision to impose tougher requirements on funding for homelessness initiatives. Plus, we'll cover other key developments from around the world and closer to home. All this and more on Alex's News. Stay tuned. This morning, tensions between the United States, Denmark, and Greenland have really boiled over, all over President Trump's renewed push to control Greenland. Our foreign affairs correspondent Ethan is with us. Ethan, what exactly has sparked this latest crisis?
This really reignited yesterday, January 16, 2026, during what was supposed to be a routine White House roundtable on rural health care. According to the Washington Post, President Trump suddenly pivoted and said he might slap tariffs on countries that, quote, do not go along with Greenland, end quote. He framed it as a national security necessity and suggested those tariffs could reach around 25%, mirroring threats he has made in the past against European pharmaceutical firms. That threat to punish allies economically if they resist an American takeover of Greenland is what pushed this into a full-blown diplomatic emergency.
So why is President Trump so fixated on Greenland? What is he saying makes it this national security must-have?
The president is essentially reviving his 2019 idea of buying Greenland, but with sharper edges. He now argues the United States needs outright sovereignty to plug what he calls a big hole in Arctic defenses, and to build a so-called Golden Dome missile shield against hypersonic weapons. Outlets like CBS News and The Guardian note he also keeps talking about Russian and Chinese ships supposedly swarming around Nuuk, Greenland's capital, and about huge reserves of rare earth minerals there. The problem, Nordic intelligence officials tell reporters, is that these dramatic threat claims are either exaggerated or just not happening the way he describes.
And this time, he is not just talking purchase. He is hinting at annexation and even military options. How has the White House explained that?
When the president warned that the United States could get Greenland, quote, the hard way, end quote, that raised a lot of alarms. The Washington Post reports that his press secretary Caroline Leavitt later said that phrase included, in her words, military options if negotiations fail. So rather than just floated real estate talk, it sounds more like a willingness to use economic or even military coercion against a NATO ally's territory. That is why many NATO governments and even some Republicans on Capitol Hill are reacting so sharply.
You mentioned Capitol Hill. There is a big congressional delegation in Denmark and Greenland right now. What are lawmakers trying to do on this trip?
An 11-member bipartisan delegation landed in Copenhagen yesterday with a very explicit message that Congress does not back annexation. The group is led by Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware and Republican Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina, with key voices like Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski, who is well known on Arctic issues. According to the Washington Post and the Northwich Guardian, the delegation is meeting Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen and Greenland's Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen to reassure them that Americans still value them as allies, not as property. Coons told reporters there are no current security threats to Greenland that would justify a takeover, and he urged Danes not to lose faith in the American people.
What exactly are they telling people in Copenhagen and Nuuk about how the United States sees Greenland?
Ethan, at a news conference this morning in Copenhagen's Christiansborg Palace, Coons talked about more than 225 years of partnership with Denmark, saying this tension is about one president, not the entire country. Lisa Murkowski, standing beside the Greenlandic flag, emphasized, as reported by the Northwich Guardian, that Greenland needs to be treated as an ally, not an asset. She cited internal polling that around 75% of Americans oppose trying to acquire the island. The delegation is describing their meetings as a strong and robust dialogue about cooperation on Arctic security, climate, and minerals within the existing alliance framework, not through a change in sovereignty.
Before this delegation left, there was that very tense meeting in Washington earlier this week. What happened there between American and Danish officials?
On January 14th, just a few days ago, Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio met with Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen and Greenlandic Foreign Minister Vivian Motzfeldt. CTV News and the National Post report that the talks ended in what diplomats politely called fundamental disagreement. The American side pushed for some kind of roadmap toward eventual annexation, while Denmark said, very plainly, Greenland is not for sale. A working group that the White House hailed as a mechanism to explore acquisition is, from the Danish perspective, only about technical security cooperation, and it has already stalled over that basic mismatch.
How are leaders in Greenland themselves responding to these claims of imminent Russian or Chinese threats?
Greenlandic politicians are pushing back hard. Aja Chemnitz, who sits in the Danish parliament, told the Northwich Guardian that American threat claims are, in her words, lies and exaggerations, and that the real dangers right now actually come from the United States side. Greenland's Prime Minister, Jens Frederik Nielsen, went even further on January 14th, saying, quote, "If we have to choose between the United States and Denmark, we choose Denmark," end quote. That is a remarkable statement, and he is making it clear that Greenland's future, in his view, lies with the existing Kingdom of Denmark, NATO, and the European Union.
Denmark is not just talking, it seems to be moving troops. What are they and other NATO countries actually doing on the ground in Greenland?
The Guardian reports that Denmark has launched Operation Arctic Endurance, which began on January 15th with small but symbolic deployments from France, Germany, Sweden, Norway, and Britain into Greenlandic territory. We are talking about only a few dozen troops in total, but in NATO jargon, these are tripwire forces meant to signal that any aggression would involve several allies immediately. It is less about military might and more about planting the NATO flag on the map. The White House has publicly shrugged this off, with Caroline Leavitt saying it has no impact, and President Trump mocking the forces on social media as, quote, two dog sleds, end quote.
Beyond the military gestures, Europe is also talking economics. How is the European Union responding to Trump's tariff threats?
European lawmakers are trying to show that economic coercion cuts both ways. Euractiv and HuffPost UK report that the European Parliament's Trade Committee, chaired by German lawmaker Bernd Lange, is moving to freeze ratification of the 2025 EU-United States trade deal that was supposed to be approved around January 26th and 27th. That agreement would cap many American tariffs at around 15% and phase out a lot of European duties on American industrial goods, including cars. Danish and other Scandinavian members of the European Parliament are arguing that pushing it through right now would reward Washington's pressure tactics, and they are openly considering retaliatory tariffs or restrictions on American investment using the European Union's new anti-coercion instrument.
There is also the basic legal question: can Greenland even be sold or annexed under Danish and Greenlandic law?
Legal experts say the hurdles are enormous. Just Security and the Arctic Institute point to Greenland's Self-Government Act of 2009, especially Section 21, which gives Greenlanders the right to decide their own status in a binding referendum, and does not imagine any simple sale. Denmark's constitution, particularly Section 19, would require the Danish parliament to approve any change of territory. On top of that, the 1951 United States-Denmark Defense Agreement already gives Washington almost everything it needs militarily, including rights to operate Patuxent Space Base, the old Thule Air Base, without owning the island.
So if the United States already has that base and those rights, why is the administration insisting sovereignty is necessary for this Golden Dome system?
Analysts at CSIS and Chatham House, quoted in Defense News, argue that the Golden Dome rationale looks more like a political and economic wish list than a genuine military requirement. Under the existing 1951 treaty, Washington can modernize radar, expand missile warning, and monitor the key GIUK gap between Greenland, Iceland, and Britain, as long as it consults Copenhagen. What sovereignty would add is the ability to build what it wants, where it wants, potentially including nuclear storage, without asking Denmark's permission. Many experts warn that would be counterproductive, because it could split NATO, scare European publics, and even raise questions about whether Article 5 collective defense would survive if one ally tried to seize another ally's territory.
How are members of Congress trying to rein in the president here at home?
On Capitol Hill, you are seeing some unusual bipartisan moves. House Democrat Jimmy Gomez has introduced the Greenland Sovereignty Protection Act, and Senators Murkowski and Jan Shaheen are pushing a NATO Unity Protection Act. According to House and Senate updates, these bills would block funding for any effort to acquire Greenland and try to tie the president's hands on using force without a formal declaration, invoking the War Powers Resolution. Lawmakers are also examining the president's authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, even as the Supreme Court prepares to weigh in on how broadly any president can wield national security tariffs.
And if the United States did try to use force or coercion, how does that square with NATO rules?
NATO's own treaty offers Denmark some tools here. Article 4 lets a member like Denmark call for urgent consultations when its territory or security feels threatened, and diplomats say Copenhagen is actively considering that. But Article 1 also commits allies to settle disputes peacefully, and Article 8 warns against international commitments that conflict with the alliance's principles. Legal scholars interviewed by B Horizon say that if the United States truly moved against Danish territory, it would trigger an existential crisis for NATO, and could even prompt the European Union to invoke its Mutual Defense Clause, Article 42.7 of the EU Treaty, in support of Denmark.
Meanwhile, what are we seeing on the streets in Denmark and Greenland today?
Protests are spreading quickly. WHYY and Channel News Asia describe marches in Copenhagen, Aarhus, Nuuk, and several smaller Greenlandic towns, with demonstrators carrying signs condemning what they call superpower rhetoric and chanting that Greenland is not for sale. There are also solidarity rallies planned in some other Nordic capitals today. For many Greenlanders, this is not just about geopolitics. It is about a long history of outside powers making decisions over their heads, and they are determined to assert their right to self-determination.
Big picture then, how serious is this for the broader transatlantic relationship and Arctic stability?
Many analysts see it as a defining stress test. Outlets like The Walrus and Radio New Zealand warn that if Washington uses the national security exception under global trade rules to hit Denmark or the European Union with tariffs over Greenland, it will reinforce a trend they call national security creep, where almost any economic dispute is recast as an emergency. That could undermine faith in both NATO and the open trading system that has underpinned the transatlantic relationship for decades. And in the Arctic itself, it risks turning a region that has mostly been cooperative into another arena of outright confrontation among great powers.
Finally, Ethan, over the next few days, what should we be watching for that will tell us whether this cools down or escalates?
Watch three things. First, whether President Trump actually signs any tariff orders or continues to use the threat as leverage. That is where markets and European officials are laser-focused. Second, whether Denmark moves to bring this formally into NATO through an Article 4 consultation, which would put every ally, including the United States, around the same table discussing Greenland. And third, whether the congressional delegation can persuade Danish and Greenlandic leaders that American institutions, beyond this administration, are still committed to the alliance and to respecting Greenland's autonomy. If those signals are reassuring, this may stay a war of words. If not, the chances of a deeper rupture grow.
A complicated and fast-moving story, and one we will keep following closely. Ethan, thanks for breaking it down for us this morning. California has spent tens of billions trying to tackle homelessness, but camps are still everywhere. Now the state is tightening the rules on who gets money. Reporter Chloe is with us. Chloe, what's changing here?
The big shift is from trust to love. Governor Gavin Newsom and lawmakers are adding strict conditions to a key grant program called Homeless Housing Assistance and Prevention, or HHAP. According to CalMatters reporting that has been shared by the Associated Press and outlets like U.S. News and World Report, the state has poured roughly $24 billion into homelessness efforts since about 2019. Yet visible encampments have not dropped much, especially in smaller and rural counties, and the governor is clearly frustrated.
So instead of just writing checks, what is the state doing differently with HHAP now?
Until recently, HHAP dollars went out pretty reliably each year, about $1 billion per round for 4 straight rounds. Now, starting with what they call Round 7, that pot is being cut in half to around $500 million for the 2026 to 2027 budget year, and it is no longer automatic. The Legislative Analyst's Office, in its 2025 to 2026 spending plan released this past October, describes the new model as performance-based funding. Local governments will have to prove they meet several statewide standards before any of that money flows.
When you say several standards, what kinds of hoops are we talking about?
State officials have laid out 4 big ones that all connect to each other. Cities and counties need a state-approved housing plan. They are pushed to earn an elite, pro-housing designation. They must adopt encampment rules that match a state model ordinance. And they have to show progress on hard numbers, like reducing unsheltered homelessness, with some of their own money on the line as a match. If they fall short, the state can delay, reduce, or even claw back funding. Newsom's message, echoed in statements from his office and quoted by CalMatters, is that the era of, quote, freely handing out cash, end quote, is over.
Let's take those one by one. First, the housing plans. What does the state want there?
Every city and county in California has to write what is called a housing element, which is basically a detailed roadmap for how they will build enough homes at all income levels. The Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, must certify those plans as realistic and compliant with state law. Under the new HHAP rules, if your housing element is not certified, your homelessness money is on hold. The logic, according to the state auditor and the LAO, is that you cannot solve encampments without fixing the underlying housing shortage.
And then there's this pro-housing label. What is that, and why does it matter now?
Pro-housing is like the state's honor roll for jurisdictions that go beyond the bare minimum on housing production. To earn it, HCD says cities and counties have to take extra steps, such as speeding up permits, allowing more apartments on each lot, or waiving some fees to get affordable projects built faster. U.S. News and World Report, citing state data, notes that as of early this year, only about 60 of California's more than 540 counties and cities have that badge, covering roughly 15% of the population. For small, rural counties with limited planning staff, rewriting zoning codes and policies to hit that mark can be a huge lift.
How about the encampment piece, especially after that big Supreme Court ruling?
That ruling, City of Grants Pass versus Johnson in 2024, gave local governments across the West more legal power to ban camping on public property, even when shelter beds are scarce. California is now saying, you can use that authority, but if you want state homelessness dollars, your encampment rules must follow a state model ordinance written by the California Interagency Council on Homelessness. That model, released last May, requires things like at least 48 hours notice before a sweep, offering people shelter or services before moving them, and storing belongings instead of just trashing them. State officials pitch it as a humane, organized way to clear camps, but it undeniably ties funding to how aggressively cities deal with visible encampments.
And the last hoop, these performance benchmarks and matching funds. How strict are those?
Pretty strict, at least on paper. Local agencies now have to show progress on metrics pulled from what the state calls system performance measures, such as how much they reduce unsheltered homelessness, how quickly they move people into permanent housing, and how long people stay homeless. According to the LAO and CalMatters, grants will be reviewed more closely, with clawback language that lets the state pull back money if it goes unused or fails to produce results. On top of that, cities and counties must put in their own dollars as a match, instead of relying solely on what started in 2019 as a one-time state boost of about $650 million.
What pushed state leaders to tighten the screws this way? Was there a specific turning point?
a series of audits and reports really set the stage. The California State Auditor, in a 2024 report labeled 2023-102.1, blasted what it called a data desert, saying the state stopped tracking key outcomes after 2021 and could not tell where a large share of people went after receiving services. One finding that stuck with lawmakers is that roughly 1/3 of people served in the first HHAP round ended up in the unknown category when they exited programs. Meanwhile, the LAO's reviews, including a March 2025 look at the Encampment Resolution Fund, found that despite billions in spending, statewide unsheltered homelessness actually rose about 6% between 2022 and 2024, and nobody could clearly say which strategies were working.
Part of this overhaul is a brand new state agency. What is that supposed to do?
Lawmakers created the California Housing and Homelessness Agency, or CHHA, in one of the budget trailer bills last fall, specifically Senate Bill 131. It is scheduled to go live on July 1st of this year, and it is meant to pull together responsibilities that have been scattered across multiple departments. The LAO has criticized that fragmentation for years, saying it made accountability nearly impossible. CHHA will run an online portal at accountability.ca.gov, where cities and counties upload detailed data so the state can track thousands of data points in one place.
Let's talk about how this feels on the ground. How are smaller, rural counties coping with all these new demands?
Mendocino County on the North Coast is a stark example that Cal Matters, the Sacramento Observer, and the Shasta Scout have all highlighted. The county was awarded roughly $8.8 million across the first 5 HHAP rounds, but according to state dashboards, had only spent about $2.6 million, while its unsheltered homelessness climbed more than 34% between 2023 and 2025. County officials say a big chunk of money is now effectively held hostage until the board passes an encampment ordinance that meets the new state model. Megan Van Sant, who manages social services there, told Cal Matters the process forces a strange split between housing providers and law enforcement instead of letting them coordinate more naturally.
Yet Mendocino did have some progress, right? It is not all failure there.
That is right, and that is part of what frustrates locals. Mendocino used HHAP money early on to help convert a hotel into supportive housing through the state's Project Homekey program, giving stable homes to about 30 families. Their official count even showed unsheltered homelessness dropping from around 552 people in 2023 to about 440 in 2024. Still, a December 2025 state audit of the county, labeled 2025-049, flagged strained finances and vulnerability to waste, even while stopping short of calling it fraud or abuse, which keeps them under a very bright spotlight.
How is this playing out in a very different community like Santa Cruz?
Santa Cruz has one of the highest homelessness rates per capita in the country, and the stakes there are huge. The county pulled in about $24.5 million over HHAP rounds 1 through 5 and has spent roughly $9.4 million to move more than 820 people into housing, with about a quarter of its funds focused specifically on homeless youth, which national rankings show as a real strength. But a 2025 local assessment, summarized by Cal Matters, found unsheltered homelessness still edged up by just over 4%, and camp clearings were described as cyclical, with people pushed from one spot to another. The county's Housing for Health director, Robert Ratner, has said applications keep coming back with new questions, calling the requirements, quote, moving goalposts, end quote, even as they pursue that coveted pro-housing status.
And Santa Cruz is still waiting on its next round of money?
Yes, and that delay is exactly what local officials fear will happen more often under this model. As of the middle of this month, Round 6 HHAP funds for Santa Cruz had not been approved, and providers told Cal Matters they might have to close shelter beds if the money does not land soon. On top of that, Round 7 statewide is half the size it used to be, so counties like Santa Cruz are facing tougher rules, potential funding gaps, and a smaller pie all at once.
What are local leaders and advocacy groups saying about these hoops overall?
Many acknowledge the need for accountability but argue the state is overshooting. Carolyn Coleman, who leads the League of California Cities, has warned that piling on conditions will lock some jurisdictions out entirely, slow down housing placements, and punish cities for things like construction costs or interest rates they cannot control. The California State Association of Counties echoes that, pointing to what the LAO called a patchwork of short-term funding streams as a bigger culprit than local mismanagement. And Monica Davalos at the California Budget and Policy Center told CalMatters that revoking or delaying funding might feel like holding officials accountable, but in practice it punishes the nonprofit service providers and the people they serve.
What do city leaders on the ground want the state to focus on instead?
Some mayors want the state to simplify the scorecard. San Jose Mayor Matt Mahan, for instance, has argued, as reported by CalMatters, that Sacramento should care most about clear outcomes, like how many people are actually housed and how quickly encampments are resolved, rather than whether a city has a specific label. Local staff say they are now diverting precious time from outreach and case management to paperwork and data entry. And with some earlier HHAP rounds already spent down, they worry about a gap where programs shut their doors before the next conditional check arrives.
But there are lawmakers backing this tough love approach. What's their argument?
Supporters say the status quo simply has not delivered. Assemblymember Sharon Quirk Silva from La Palma has defended these rules, saying that after years of visible encampments despite massive spending, taxpayers deserve to see what is working and what is not. She has aligned closely with Governor Newsom's 2023 push to, as he put it, quote, clean up encampments, end quote, while insisting the state also fund treatment and housing. They point to the Supreme Court's Grants Pass decision as a reason to pair enforcement power with strict expectations that money actually buys real alternatives to sidewalk living.
That court case keeps coming up. Can you explain the tension it creates for local governments?
Grants Pass essentially told cities they are allowed to criminalize camping on public land, even when shelter beds are limited, reversing earlier rulings that had constrained them. So legally, California cities now have more room to clear tents, but the HHAP rules go the opposite direction financially, saying you only get money if your encampment policies guarantee offers of shelter and services first and track what happens to people after a sweep. Smaller counties say that means they could technically crack down more, but if they do it without the full service first model the state prefers, they risk losing the very funds they would need to build that model in the first place.
Looking ahead from this January 17th vantage point, what are the key dates and decisions to watch?
According to CalMatters, lawmakers still need to finalize some of the details of HHAP Round 7 in follow-up bills expected in February, and all 4 major requirements are supposed to be fully in place by the state budget deadline this June. The new California Housing and Homelessness Agency takes formal control on July 1st, and that accountability.ca.gov portal becomes the main gateway for plans and data after that. If a county does not have its housing element certified, its encampment ordinance approved, and its performance benchmarks lined up by then, it could see HHAP money delayed well into the next fiscal year. In the meantime, local officials are bracing for a rough spring and summer as temporary COVID-era and early HHAP grants finally run out.
With all of this in motion, what are the big unanswered questions this morning?
One core question, raised by the Legislative Analyst's Office and reflected in coverage by U.S. News and World Report, is whether tightening rules on struggling counties will actually reduce the number of people who are unsheltered, or simply separate the well-staffed from the understaffed. Critics note that California still ranks poorly on affordability and health outcomes, so people are being pushed into homelessness faster than systems can pull them out. Even a perfectly designed accountability portal cannot fix sky-high rents, untreated addiction, or the loss of cheap motels and rooming houses. The LAO has suggested that lasting progress will require more stable, long-term funding and true state coordination, not just more complicated grant applications.
And for someone listening in a California city or a small town right now, how might they actually feel these changes in their daily lives?
They might notice more intense debates at city council meetings over housing plans, zoning rules, and encampment ordinances, because those decisions now directly determine whether local shelters and outreach teams keep their funding. Service providers could be spending more time tracking outcomes and uploading data, at least in the short term, which they worry might pull attention away from street-level work. Supporters hope that a few years from now, this data-heavy system will clearly show which programs are worth scaling and which ones are not, and finally start bending those unsheltered numbers down. But as CalMatters put it in a piece published just yesterday, there is a real risk that in the near term, bureaucracy will win out over urgency, and the people who feel that gap most sharply are those still sleeping outside tonight.
A complicated mix of accountability and real human stakes. Chloe, thanks for walking us through it.
Thanks, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. In Richmond, Virginia, history put on its power suit and heels. Abigail Spanberger was sworn in at noon as the Commonwealth's 75th governor, the first woman to hold the office since 1776, ending a 250-year streak of all-male leadership. Flanked by a Democratic-led General Assembly on the Capitol steps, she framed her agenda under the banner, United for Virginia's Future, promising a pragmatic, centrist push to cut consumer costs and expand healthcare access. The inauguration also rewrote the state's record books. Ghazala Hashmi became the first Muslim woman lieutenant governor, and Jay Jones the first black attorney general. Outgoing Governor Glenn Youngkin handed Spanberger the keys to the executive mansion, a literal pass of the torch, as she prepares early executive orders on affordability and new appointments to the University of Virginia's Board of Visitors, while vowing to shield the state's economy and civil service from Trump administration policies in Washington. On the Nile, diplomacy is trying to turn bad blood into good water. President Donald Trump has written to Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, offering to restart U.S. mediation over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, putting what he calls a resolution to the GERD dispute at the very top of his peace agenda. The proposed framework would guarantee predictable water releases for downstream Egypt and Sudan during droughts, while letting Ethiopia fully tap the dam's hydroelectric potential and even sell power. It's an effort to turn a potential flashpoint between Cairo and Addis Ababa into water under the bridge, after earlier talks collapsed and Ethiopia inaugurated the $5 billion project last September, leaving one of Africa's mightiest rivers at the center of a regional power struggle. To Ukraine now, where a search for peace comes with the power off. A high-level delegation, led by Presidential Chief of Staff Kirilo Budanov and National Security Chief Rustem Umerov, has arrived in the United States to sell a 20-point peace and victory plan. In Miami, they'll huddle with U.S. Envoy Steve Witkoff, Advisor Jared Kushner, and Army Secretary Daniel Driscoll on post-war security guarantees and an $800 billion reconstruction package. The talks race a brutal clock. A massive Russian winter air campaign has shredded Ukraine's energy grid, leaving about 70% of Kyiv without electricity and destroying key facilities in Kharkiv amid sub-zero temperatures. President Volodymyr Zelensky says Ukraine seeks a fair peace, but argues the strikes show Moscow is trying to freeze the country into capitulation as negotiators scramble to lock in a bilateral security framework before next week's World Economic Forum in Davos. In health news, a new gold standard study has taken the ache out of a heated debate. A Lancet meta-analysis of 43 studies finds no causal link between prenatal Tylenol use and autism, ADHD, or intellectual disabilities once shared family genetics are rigorously controlled. Earlier red flag findings, including a 2025 Harvard analysis, largely melt away under these sibling-based models. The results sharply undercut recent Trump administration guidance and moves by HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to discourage acetaminophen in pregnancy. Medical experts say the evidence strongly supports keeping Tylenol as the safest first-line treatment for maternal fever, Important because untreated high temperatures themselves raise developmental risks, offering long-awaited relief to confused expectant parents and clinicians, and putting federal policy on the exam table. And under the sea, climate change is literally taking a bite out of the food chain. New research from Germany's Heinrich Heine University Dusseldorf shows that rising ocean acidification is corroding the teeth of blacktip reef sharks. When exposed to the more acidic conditions projected for the year 2300, shark teeth developed cracks, holes, and severe root damage compared with today's waters. Even their crucial serrated edges, the steak knives of the sea, began to dull and crumble. Sharks do grow replacement teeth, but scientists warn this acid test could outpace nature's dental plan, weakening these apex predators' hunting ability. Already strained by overfishing and habitat loss, blacktip reef sharks may find their jaws of power turning into jaws of worry, with potential ripple effects through marine food webs, global fisheries, and tourism. Conservationists say if we don't curb carbon emissions, the oceans' top enforcers could be left all bark and no bite. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.